Yeah, the next panelist is Ellen SCHNEPEL from the Research Institute of Man, and she'll be talking on Banzil's Pan-Creole idealism and grassroots reality in the Lesser Antilles.
I was originally asked to participate in this session because in many theories of development within the Caribbean, there's no infusion of language or models of language that are being incorporated, and so I'm trying to bridge that gap. We'll see how successful I can. And in that respect, I'm talking about a Pan-Creole movement, a socio-cultural movement within the Caribbean that has linkages with the Indian Ocean, and my particular focus today is more from the perspective of the elites and what they are doing. Insurgent movements seeking to redress social, economic, and political grievances frequently rally around cultural symbols as effective emblems for group solidarity and political mobilization. Banzil Creole, which means Creole Archipelago, was established in the 1980s by native linguists in the Francophone zone of the Caribbean and Indian Ocean with the intent of obtaining both in the home countries and on the international scene a new recognition of Creole languages on the level of functional communication and scientific discourse. A decade later, Banzil's euphoria and idealism have paled as cleavages have emerged. The internationalist movement has undercut nationalist or local movements in various islands where quite different needs and objectives from the Banzil partisans have been identified. Furthermore, tensions have surfaced between local elites and popular masses over the motivation, goals, authenticity, and authority of the movement. In this paper, I intend to follow briefly the itinerary of Banzil and to discuss some of the underlying issues and problems in a movement which selected the language issue as the chief arena of struggle. This choice was to the exclusion of the overriding issue of structural, social, or economic change, and therefore effectively raised the issue of whether the language question should precede, follow, or go hand in hand with the resolution of the class question in the post-colonial era. At the end of the 1960s, the word Creole, when it referred to an anthropological universe tied to French colonization, was fairly unknown to either the general public or to specialists. To be sure, a number of monographs and collected works had already been published, in English and in French, more often concerning the Caribbean than the Indian Ocean, and the names of Melville Herskovitz, Sidney Mintz, Michel Liris, or Roger Bastide were well known to the profession. But these studies were synchronic descriptions of a single society or broad syntheses following traditional fields of study, which incorporated the concepts of African resistance or cultural retentions, Afro-American syncretism, or even plantation America. One could not say that this research, while undoubtedly still pertinent today, founded a truly coherent and unified French Creole field of study in the same way as Caribbean regional studies were coming of age then. On the other hand, in the domain of linguistics, the works of Morris Goodman and Robert Hall, as well as the two Mona conferences in 1959 and 1968, advanced considerably the idea of the need for a French lexically based Creolistics, deserving of a special approach. Among other problems, the question of the genesis of Creoles took on importance, and the different sides were developing increasingly inflexible arguments by defining variously the respective roles of French and African languages in the Creolization process. By another route, the idea emerged that the attitudes and linguistic positions of the speakers concerned should be integrated with the choices, often divergent, of the elites in Creolophone countries. Thus, one began to read in the works of various Creolists that glottopolitics could be an object of scientific investigation. The decade of the 1970s then marked the advance of Creole studies, in particular Creole languages and societies united by a French colonial past. Increasing numbers of linguists, anthropologists, historians, and educators devoted research to these areas, finding the means to compare their results and to coordinate their programs by meeting in collective structures such as international conferences and seminars. Linked to this development, the contributions of European researchers, notably French social scientists like Jean Benoit and Robert Chaudonson, must be acknowledged. Their work was contemporaneous with renewed interest in the countries of the Indian Ocean and comparison of this region in the Caribbean with Francophone Africa. All these conditions prepared the way for what has been called in sociolinguistics language planning and development, or glottopolitics, owing much to the advances of Fishman, Hagen, and Ferguson in the United States. The 1980s confirmed the success of the field of French-based creolistics, while the French entry to this emerging field came almost 2 decades after British and American interest had been registered. In a short space of time, a highly centralized infrastructure was in place. The Comité International des Études Créoles was formed, the journal Études Créoles and a bulletin Gazette s'y Fomblé La Voix Cabaye were launched, and funding mechanisms were established for research, publications, and regularly scheduled international conferences. Yet precisely the difference between the French Creole world and that of the English Creoles was the unresolved issue of the political status of the French overseas departments, namely Martinique, Guadeloupe, Guyane in the Caribbean, and Réunion in the Indian Ocean, and also the problem of French cultural hegemony. These two issues contributed an ideological and political dimension to the study and promotion of French Creoles. From this decade on, in the name of the autonomy of the object and the nativization of procedures, and from a need for applied research, we note the appearance of a new and original current, that of native linguistics. If this movement originated principally from the spectacular development of secular linguistics in universities and research centers in North America and Europe, one must also add to this analysis an undeniable internal dynamic infused by a certain number of researchers and intellectuals born in the countries concerned and thus speakers themselves of these traditionally stigmatized languages. Between the second conference organized by the Comité International des Études Créoles in Mahé in the Seychelles in 1979 and the third conference in Vieux-Fort, St. Lucia in 1981, native researchers discovered that apart from the pleasure of gathering together, a certain community of vision inspired them all in terms of their relationship to their mother tongues, to the place these languages should be accorded in their respective educational systems, to the problems of intercomprehension, and to other questions related to their graphic and literary standardization which needed to be addressed. Moreover, a form of identity-based insurgency came over this group which manifested itself in an attitude of hypervalorization of inter-Creole communication. These few researchers, young for the most part and coming from Mauritius, the Seychelles, Réunion, and the Franco-Creolophone islands of the Caribbean, decided to form a Comité Benzil Creole with the purpose of joining their efforts and obtaining a new recognition of Creole languages on the level of functional communication and scientific discourse. Motivated by a rationale both internal and communal to the group, and marked by a euphoric feeling of pan-Creolité, the Comité attempted in vain to launch a bulletin. It did succeed, however, in organizing 2 conferences, one in the Seychelles in 1982 and another in Réunion in 1984. It was also instrumental in establishing the idea of an International Creole Day celebrated at the same time on the last Friday in the month of October in each country and within the Creole diasporas in Europe and North America. Creole even became the subject of discussion on several occasions. For example, the attempt of the Seychelles to have Creole inscribed as a recognized language by UNESCO, then the publication in 1984 of an anthology of Creole poetry, and the appearance of the proceedings of the 1984 Benzil Conference in Réunion. If one cannot say that a new field of scientific inquiry had appeared, nor a true linguistics school, not even a simple current, it remains that the combination of these events had a real significance, the importance of which was signaled by scholars as well as by politicians. Even the public at large, composed of non-specialists, had to admit the scale of the Creole movement. Yet the effects of Benzil have been registered quite unequally throughout its zone of influence. From Haiti, for example, where the population has virtually never heard of its structure or of its accomplishments, to the Seychelles, where it is a state affair propelled by the press and through artistic festivals, and thus widely popularized, passing by Mauritius, where the local comité changed its name and dropped the adjective Creole from its title due to the semantics of the term Creole, which associate it more particularly with one ethnic group. And finally, from one French overseas department to another, according to the energies of its members, one can say that Benzil and its celebration of Creole have little by little implanted the idea of the need to reflect on Creole communication from one country to another. Whatever the case, Benzil Creole has shown for over a decade now the immense thirst for cultural definition which has seized certain peoples living in the tropics within the French orbit. These societies fall more or less into 2 categories. On the one hand, there are several countries which experienced French colonization during a relatively short but significant period of their history, and which have since become sovereign or independent states, all but one during the era of decolonization following the Second World War. These states differ in their statuses, statutes, and types of government, and today have adopted diverse political postures towards linguistic and cultural problems. And among this group are St. Lucia, Dominica, Haiti, Mauritius, and the Seychelles. Each country attaches to its Creole language undeniable sentimentality, but if school policy is resolutely and explicitly pro-Creole in the Seychelles, the official positions are much cooler in Mauritius and quite ambivalent in Haiti. Paradoxically, it is in the largest Creolophone country of the world, which is also one of the poorest, where the most radical educational policy in Creole should be pursued, and yet the succession of regimes from the Duvaliers to the present have demonstrated the utmost hypocrisy verging on cynicism with respect to the language. The second group of countries represented in Banzil, and which have witnessed without a doubt a still greater euphoria of Creolite, is constituted by the 4 French overseas departments, namely Guadeloupe, Martinique, French Guiana, and Réunion. Long under French control, these territories were politically assimilated by France in 1946. As a result, the linkage of language and identity plays out differently in these regions where the Creole question has frequently been aligned with the autonomist or independentist movements in opposition to French domination. Yet in each island, the structure, content, and size of these movements vary. And I use the plural form here simply because these diverse nationalist movements exist in conjunction as well as in competition with the larger Pan-Creole movement. The launching of Banzil in the 1980s raises a number of fundamental issues. Why did these researchers, conscious of the fact that they are Creolophone, so strongly feel the need to create a distinct structure from that which permitted them to meet on a regular basis, namely the Comité International des Études Créoles, which was formed in 1976? Originating from countries whose political statuses and ethnic traditions are so diverse, was it reasonable to pose the question of the unity of their culture, common and yet so different? Is there a relationship other than symbolic between nationalism and linguistic militancy? And is it only translatable in the context of a critique of French imperialism? Was it necessary in order to embark on this trans-Creole adventure to distance oneself from purely fundamental considerations, such as the relationship between Creole discourse and social or economic development, and to put aside problems at times quite painful, such as illiteracy, school failure, culture and literary creation, or more simply the affirmation of social and political identity? What have been the limits of this action and what remains of it today? How have the native actors resolved their relations with Europeans and Americans working alongside them? And what has happened to the famous Banzil solidarity, which promised so much in the beginning of the movement? In response to this array of questions, and in an attempt to sift out the real problematic, I shall treat briefly some of the pitfalls, omissions, and failures of this internationalist movement. Creole legitimacy could not be obtained by simply holding conferences in a Creole-speaking environment and including native personalities within its ranks. Native participants also became convinced of the importance of exploring Pan-Creole communication beyond the ritualistic expression of solidarity through the development of Creole scientific discourse and the formation of a distinct autonomous organization like Banzil. Certain projects of Banzil did validate the Pan-Creole concept by establishing that it was not just an ephemeral outcome of the native versus non-native conflict in the field of Creole studies. Rather, the real line of demarcation was between those whose interest is purely intellectual and academic and those who are also interested in contributing to the social development of the people who speak Creole languages. Creole is more an object of study for these native researchers for whom the language is their mother tongue. It is the means and code for individual and collective liberation and development. Yet, ironically, native Creolists have failed to confront head-on the economic question embedded within the language issue, whether Creole could play a role in social mobility, economic development, and social transformation in these societies as they are increasingly drawn into the global economy. Of course, grassroots realities vary from island to island, and I'd like to point out that in the independent states of Dominica and St. Lucia, Creole has begun to play a vital role in agricultural extension programs, hurricane warnings on the radio, and health education. Whereas in the neighboring islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe, Creole remains more a symbol of national liberation and an effective political weapon used at demonstrations against French racist practices or as the preferred code of the independentist radio stations. Banzil didn't develop a lucid, coherent vision of what it stood for as a Pan-Creole movement. social consciousness was not clearly articulated in terms of goals, options, strategies, and resources. Its objective to develop Creole into a literary and scientific medium didn't progress beyond a seminar held in Réunion in 1984. Furthermore, the idea of a great Creole family scattered around the world remained largely unexplored and failed to exert enough attraction to overcome the countervailing feelings of distance and difference among the islands represented, as well as between elites and masses within each island context. While the militant phase of Banzil at the St. Lucia Conference in 1981 resulted in a spontaneous recourse to Creole from the belief among Native researchers that communicating in one's Creole was possible, no real distinction was established between language use and language engineering. Instead, these two dimensions were mechanically linked into a single process in the wishful hope that the instrument could be forged through actual use. The idea of operating and publishing in Creole was a complicated problem, for there did not exist one Creole of which the different varieties are offshoots, but a diversity of Creoles varying from one geographical zone to another, from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean. Two general truths emerge. French is the scientific, intellectual, and cultural language of the overwhelming majority of educated people in the Creole world. And secondly, the search for a pan-Creole language as an international language leads almost inevitably back to French itself, unless one should choose to impose arbitrarily the dominance of one of these Creoles. And in conclusion, I'd like to mention that the major lesson to be drawn from the Banzil experience is the need for a more pragmatic approach to the problems of Creole languages and societies, seen from a local and regional standpoint rather than through a problematic global vision of Creolophonie. Success stories do exist in Creole discourse and indigenous knowledge being utilized for local development purposes. Unfortunately, there's no time here to go into this area, but I would like to bring to your attention a special volume of the International Journal of the Sociology of Language, which is dedicated to the ideology and politics of diverse Creole movements in the Francophone orbit, which is coming out in 1993, edited by Félix Proudhon and myself, which deals with these case studies like St. Lucia, Dominica, Martinique, and Guadeloupe. For example, in multilingual pluriethnic Guyane, Creole is being utilized in health education campaigns to disseminate information on AIDS. Of interest, the script utilized bears no relationship with the Jurek graphic system proposed by the Martinican linguist and founding Banzil member Jean Bernabé, but rather is one that conforms more with popular tastes and facility in decoding Creole as a previously unwritten language. The above example points out that language engineering schemes and the utilization of Creole for social development must be in tune with grassroots realities and popular needs, not with the whims of elites working within the global framework of a new Francophonie which is attempting to establish new relations between French and the national languages in the Francophone zone. For the over 10 million Creole-speaking masses, evidence of a pan-Creole movement is largely unknown or ignored as more salient issues of education, jobs, secure wages, and access to health care hold center stage. Thank you.